We are living through a golden age of football. The sport has never been more widely played or viewed, both in stadiums and on television, and players have never been better remunerated for their talents. So why do so many football fans feel disillusioned with the sport, and like something magical that caused them to fall in love with football has been lost? Is it Saudi Arabia offering €1 billion for a single season of Kylian Mbappé? The ease with which Manchester City won their third successive Premier League title, or social media accounts seemingly celebrating ticket prices increasing by 1,660%, pricing anyone who isn't extremely wealthy out of watching their local team? Well, I would contest that the answer is actually none of the above, but rather that they are merely symptoms of a deeper malaise that has rotted the world of football from the inside. Club football is now less competitive and more predictable than it has ever previously been, and is increasingly controlled almost exclusively by a charcuterie of amoral billionaires and bloodthirsty authoritarian regimes, most of whom actually have next to no interest in the sport. And when you put it like that, well, it doesn't sound like quite so much of a golden age anymore, does it? So in today's video, I want to try and examine whether, as it is so often claimed, football really is broken. What that word even means in this context, when it broke, if indeed that is the case, who broke it, why it is still so immensely popular for something that has supposedly suffered such a fate, and what the prospects of it ever being fixed are. I know, it's quite a lot to get through, so I'll cut back on my usual rambling introductions and just get right into it. It is an interesting paradox that football is at its most popular when it is least competitive. In theory, the weakening of competition and the increased predictability of results and trophy winners that we see every season ought to weaken the sport as a spectacle and as a product. What has happened is the precise opposite. In the 6 seasons before the breakaway of the Premier League in 1992, 4 different teams won the First Division title, namely Arsenal, Liverpool, Leeds and Everton. The first Premier League TV deal in 1992 was worth £191.5 million. By 1997, 5 years into the project, Manchester United had won 4 out of a possible 5 Premier League titles, the sole exception coming in 1995 when Blackburn Rovers pipped them to the title by just a solitary point. Yet, the Premier League's second TV deal in 1997, by which stage English football's top flight was just objectively much less competitive, was worth £670 million, an increase of 250%. The Premier League's foreign and domestic TV rights deal for the 3-year cycle from 2022 to 2025 is now worth north of £10 billion, making it by far the most lucrative league in all of world football. That is despite the fact that Manchester City have now won 5 out of the last 6 Premier League titles, one of them by as many as 19 points. They won the treble this season, and they are big favourites to win a 4th successive Premier League crown next season. Very plainly then, competition alone, or the lack thereof, and the accompanying predictability that brings with it, is not enough to deter people's interest in football on its own. I've long been interested in why that is the case, and it is something that we will come on to, but first of all it is worth examining why football became so uncompetitive in the first place. It's often said that football has always been all about money. Points tallies have always correlated roughly with budgets, and the biggest teams have always hoovered up the most trophies. That is maybe 50% true. Money has always played a role in football, having more of it has rarely hurt anyone, and the biggest teams winning most of the trophies is almost necessarily true, but is just circular reasoning, at least if you define biggest as meaning something akin to the most successful. Huddersfield Town, for example, were one of the biggest clubs in England during the 1920s, when they were winning things, but few would argue that they are now. It's also 50% false though. Money may always have played a role, but the suggestion that its role hasn't grown exponentially in prominence throughout the last half century, and particularly over the last 2 to 3 decades, is just flat out wrong. Sticking with the example of English football just for the time being, as the oldest but also now the most lucrative football league pyramid on the planet, until 1960, the Football League had a maximum wage. Initially set at just £4 a week in 1900, the maximum wage was gradually increased over time, peaking at £20 a week in 1958 before it was abolished in 1960. In 1939, the £8 maximum wage for footballers was double the average salary for a man with an industrial job, which was used as a justification for it being more than adequate. By 1960, however, when the wage limit was abolished, the highest paid footballers were only paid 1.5 times as much as the average industrial wage, so in real terms, their pay had fallen 25% in 21 years. To put that 1.5x figure into some context, Erling Haaland, who was the highest paid player in the Premier League last season, was paid 1,639 times as much as the average worker in the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the contract Saudi Arabia reportedly offered Kylian Mbappé would equate to over 15,000 times the average salary in Saudi Arabia. So, that is a slight difference, I suppose. What's more, because there was a maximum wage imposed for so long, and pretty much every club could afford to pay someone £20 a week if they wanted to, there was no real financial incentive for players to move clubs. Stanley Matthews, who is arguably still England's greatest ever footballer, only ever played for Stoke City and Blackpool, earning the Football League's maximum wage for almost 30 years. He could have joined Arsenal or Manchester United, both of whom would have loved to have signed him along with everyone else, and where he would have been much more likely to win trophies, but they couldn't actually have paid him any more money than Blackpool or Stoke. Since Matthews was from Stoke-on-Trent then, and had all of his friends and family there, and owned a hotel in Blackpool, where he also spent a lot of time, he chose to live and work exclusively in Stoke and Blackpool. Perhaps, if no team could pay a player more than, let's say, £2,000 or even £10,000 a week now, Jack Grealish would still be at Aston Villa, Luke Shaw at Southampton, and James Maddison at Coventry City. When Preston North End legend Sir Tom Finney discussed his status as a de facto one-club man, who devoted his career to his boyhood club, despite being one of the best players on the planet, and the praise that he received for doing so in his autobiography, he was quick to point out that he wasn't really that loyal, because he couldn't earn more money anywhere else. Had he been playing now, Finney wrote, in 2004, then there's no way that he would have spent his entire career at Preston North End. By contrast, if Stoke City or Preston had a player of Matthews or Finney's calibre now, they would most likely be poached for a nominal fee while still playing academy football, or, failing that, after a single season like Jude Bellingham at Birmingham City. It has become impossible now for anyone other than about 11 clubs in all of world football to keep hold of anyone with genuine star power for more than a couple of seasons at most. So the money now is totally incomparable to previous generations, with the most growth actually having come in recent years. When the Premier League started in 1992, John Barnes was the league's highest paid player on £10,000 a week. In 2001, Sol Campbell became the league's first £100,000 a week player. Now we are on the verge of the first £1 million a week player in English football, and some argue that we may already be there, depending upon which reports you choose to believe, with regard to Erling Haaland's various bonuses and contract clauses. The highest paid player in world football 10 years ago was Cristiano Ronaldo, on $21.9 million a year at Real Madrid. Kylian Mbappé is reported to have just been offered $775 million to spend a single season playing for Al Hilal. That is a 35 times increase in just the last 10 years. Following the same trajectory as that, you would have a footballer being paid over $27 billion a year by 2033, enough to make them the richest person on the planet over the course of a 10-year career. Of course, that is unlikely to happen, but Who would have predicted that Kylian Mbappé could be earning €13.5 million a week playing in Saudi Arabia next season, when he scored a hat-trick in the World Cup final in December, let alone 10 years ago? There are no longer any safe predictions in football, and certainly not when it comes to the spiralling finances of the sport. Whereas football clubs used to be owned by wealthy local businessmen, merchants, and factory owners, now they're owned by hedge funds and foreign countries. Even someone like Jack Walker, who was once the poster boy of Premier League spending at Blackburn Rovers during the 1990s, was only estimated to have amassed a personal fortune of £600 million. I use the word only very cautiously there, of course, but that sized fortune would today make him the fifth poorest owner in the Premier League, with less than 0.01% of the wealth of the league's richest owners, namely Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund. So it's not just that the money in football is incomparable now to at any stage in the past, by multiple orders of magnitude, but it's what that money can do. The clubs with the most money, who pay the highest transfer fees and the most in wages, now invariably sign the best players, to an extent that just wasn't previously the case. The super-rich clubs have now started to monopolise talent with their own financing and football-related income, cementing their status at the top of the sports food chain, and allowing them to make mistakes that would be disastrous or fatal for just about everyone else. A significant element of risk and jeopardy, therefore, upon which the excitement and entertainment of almost all sport is surely built, has long been lost in football. The reason why we have seen the first ever 100-point seasons in Italy, Spain and England, and invincible seasons in 10 different European leagues since 2010 isn't just because teams started trying harder or had single fairy tale campaigns. It is because of the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of just a tiny number of clubs, both domestically and internationally, and the increasing concentration of talent that comes with it. We see this almost everywhere. Premier League hegemony in Europe is now virtually absolute, threatened by only a handful of super clubs like Real Madrid and Bayern Munich. The team that finishes bottom of the Premier League each season, and is therefore relegated to the Championship, now receives more money in TV revenue than the team that wins the Serie A title. It's for that reason that a club like Fulham, fresh off the back of a season in the Championship, and with a stadium that holds barely 20,000 fans, can take one of Sporting's star players like João Palhinha off their hands for £20 million. This seems normal to us now, but it's actually very new. Even within the Premier League, the disparities are enormous. Manchester City over the last 6 years have been the most dominant team in the entire history of English football over any 6-year period. Meanwhile, the top 6 teams in terms of revenue, much as Chelsea did their best to show that it can actually be done last season, now find it practically impossible to finish outside of the top 8. The only teams outside of the big 5 of Manchester United, Liverpool, Chelsea, Tottenham and Arsenal to break into the top 4 over the last 15 years have been Manchester City and Newcastle United, both owned by brutal authoritarian petro-states in Western Asia, and Leicester City, who won the league during a freak season but now find themselves in the Championship. It's a similar story in every major top flight in Europe. The likes of Celtic and Dinamo Zagreb face the unusual paradox of seeing both sides of football's enormous inequalities every season. Domestically, where their revenue and budgets far outstrip their rivals, they hoover up trophies with ease. In Europe, where all of a sudden they find themselves on the opposite end of those exact same inequalities, they're suddenly facing teams with 10, 15 or even 20 times their budgets, and, invariably, they meet the same fate as the minnows that they come up against at home. Between 1985 and 1995, the likes of Steaua Bucharest, Porto, PSV Eindhoven, Red Star Belgrade, Marseille and Ajax all won the European Cup or Champions League. That isn't that long ago, but it is practically unthinkable now. Not just that teams from Serbia and Romania could win European football's biggest prize, or that all of those teams could win it in just a 10-year span, but really that any of them could win it at any stage now. Between 2013 and 2023, by contrast, the only teams to win the Champions League were Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Liverpool, Chelsea and Manchester City. Football still has the pretense of unpredictability. There are shocks and upsets every now and then throughout the course of most seasons, like Brentford doing the double over Manchester City, and Manchester United getting battered 4-0 by Brentford and 7-0 by Liverpool, but at the end of the season, Man City still won their third successive Premier League title, and Manchester United still finished third. You can now predict, with unerring accuracy, the outcome of every major football league before a ball has even been kicked, based solely upon each team's wage bill. And that, if we're being entirely honest with ourselves, doesn't make it sound quite as exciting as Sky Sports would have you believe, does it? Whilst transfer, salary and spending records keep getting smashed by the super rich, seemingly on a weekly basis since the emergence of the Saudi abomination, clubs who mean everything to their local communities, both small and large, are sinking without a trace. Here in England, we have seen Bury, Macclesfield and Hereford United all go to the wall in recent years, historic clubs with centuries of history, and even a couple of FA Cups to their name in Bury's case. A similar existential threat faces the likes of Scunthorpe United, Yeovil Town and Oldham Athletic, clubs who are beset by crises, and even larger clubs like Derby County, Coventry City and Birmingham City have come perilously close to extinction in recent years. Heck, it's only 5 years since Aston Villa, now among the Premier League's biggest spenders and back in Europe, were threatened with a winding up order by HMRC over an unpaid £4 million tax bill. The Championship is lauded as being the world's best second tier, which may well be true, but it is also the world's most indebted league as a percentage of revenue, as clubs throw everything at the dream of Premier League promotion, treating it at times like a spin at the roulette wheel. The entire division is pretty much a disaster waiting to happen, or, in some instances, one that has already happened. A majority of English football's 92 Premier League and EFL teams are technically insolvent, meaning that their debts outweigh the combined value of all of their assets. The picture isn't any better outside of England. There is chaos in France, where we have seen recent disasters at Bordeaux, Sochaux, and AS Nancy. In Italy, where Parma, Fiorentina, and Napoli have all gone bust at various stages, along with a handful of clubs who never bounced back, unlike those three, and even in Germany, where there is considerably better governance of the game, Hertha Berlin, Hamburg, Hanover, Kaiserslautern, Nuremberg, and Schalke will all be in the second Bundesliga next season, which means Germany's second tier will be home to more former Bundesliga title winners than the Bundesliga itself. As the volume and concentration of wealth in football has accelerated, the amount of money paid to those, particularly at the top of the sport, has become obscene. It is a reasonable view, I think, and one to which I've always subscribed, that if football generates outrageous amounts of money, it is probably fair that lots of that money should be funneled to the players themselves. After all, they are the ones that people pay to watch, they are, in effect, the product, and better for hard-working young people, typically from working-class backgrounds, to be very highly paid than for billionaire owners and states to hoover up even more cash still, as was the case with the factory owners and businessmen who owned clubs during the era of the maximum wage. I still think that is broadly true, but what we are seeing now is something quite different. The money comes so early and so fast for talented young players that many are millionaires before they have even left school. It's hard for anyone not to lose all sense and perspective of reality in those circumstances, and the way in which they are pampered in top academies can engender an unhealthy culture of impunity and entitlement that lasts into adulthood. The argument that if football generates X, then so-and-so player deserves Y is also now being tested. even if we are to accept that X is billions of pounds and Y in the tens of hundreds of millions. That's because if we take the case of Saudi Arabia as not the only but the most notable current example, the salaries they are offering players are not the proceeds of the sport itself or what those players might be worth in the traditional sense of the term. Saudi Arabia has just set aside billions of dollars for a football project. The Saudi Pro League itself, in its entirety in fact, doesn't generate enough revenue to pay the salaries of any one of the league's top earners. It had become hard to justify footballers' salaries when they earn twice as much in a week on average in the Premier League than the average UK worker makes in a year, but without that correlation, it becomes even more difficult. In the UK, during a brutal cost of living crisis, it costs over £1,000 a year to subscribe to all of the relevant Premier League television packages, and in excess of £1,800 for all football packages beyond just the Premier League. It is obscene, and that's before you contemplate ever actually attending any matches, and unlike everywhere else, even when you pay over £1,000 in the UK, there are still loads of games that you're not allowed to watch due to broadcasters only showing one game when multiple fixtures take place at the same time, and the 3 PM blackout on a Saturday, which prohibits any fixtures from being broadcast live at that time. In Saudi Arabia, by contrast, revenue isn't generated by extortionate matchday commercial or television deals, but by the central government via oil wealth, which is arguably even more vulgar and obscene. There is this idea that Saudi Arabia has unlimited funds to throw at football and footballers for as long as they wish, without it ever moving the needle with regards to the nation's finances, and it's easy to see how that belief has been able to proliferate in people's minds. Certainly, they have acted as though it were the case during this transfer window. The reality, as I pointed out in my extensive video on whether Saudi Arabia can buy football just as they bought golf, which is well worth a watch of course, is that Saudi Arabia's GDP is half the size of Canada's and a third of the size of the United Kingdom's. Their GDP per capita is lower than Belgium, Austria and Ireland's, and their sovereign wealth fund is half the size of Norway's. This is a country, though they don't disclose any official statistics, where an estimated 20% of the population live in poverty. Yet the House of Saud is offering Kylian Mbappé and PSG €1 billion for the Frenchman to spend a single season playing in Riyadh. It's all about priorities, I suppose. Saudi Arabia is a nation which is built upon the extraction and exportation of crude oil, of which the country exports roughly $160 billion worth on an annual basis. That means that Mbappé alone, for a single season, would have cost 0.68% of Saudi Arabia's total oil exports during that time. It is almost 3% of what Saudi Arabia spent on transport and infrastructure throughout the entirety of 2022. That is not limitless, even if you behave as though it were. The fact that Saudi Arabia is such a regressive and brutal dictatorship, with one of the world's most appalling human rights records, further disillusions a lot of football fans as much as the finances themselves. What's more, this isn't a case of short-term spending with the aim of long-term gain. Purely in terms of the finances, football will never be a profitable endeavour for Saudi Arabia. This is a case of reputation management, both abroad but particularly at home, where Saudi Arabia has a young population that is very enthusiastic about football. You cannot protest, organise, freely express yourselves, or say anything vaguely critical of the House of Saud, but you can have Ronaldo and Benzema. Seems like a fair trade-off to me. Freedoms are overrated. Marcelo Brozovic, on the other hand, well, he has always been perennially underrated if you ask me. Welcome, Marcelo, to Al Nassr. There's also an element of dick swinging, for want of a better word. The oil-dependent nations of Western Asia are all desperately trying to diversify their economies and sanitize their reputations, as their economies are built almost entirely on something that is literally rapidly destroying the planet, and even if it wasn't, is still a finite resource. The UAE has been able to do this much more effectively than Saudi Arabia to date, through cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And in football, Abu Dhabi has enjoyed enormous success at Manchester City, whilst Qatar has attracted some of the world's biggest names to PSG, as well as hosting the FIFA World Cup. Saudi Arabia is playing catch-up then, but wants to illustrate that it has the longest in town, and if you don't want elite-level football to become a phallus-measuring contest between some of the world's worst people and the petro-states, which they run as their own personal chiefdoms, well, too late I'm afraid, because it already is. Football's enduring popularity, despite all of these problems which plague and, you could argue, have broken and continue to inflict further damage upon the integrity and appeal of the sport, I think owes to a number of things. Firstly, football is just a fantastic sport. It's simple, it's accessible, it's low scoring, which makes it more unpredictable, and it has the remarkable knack of throwing up iconic and unwritable moments, even if the end of the script has become all too easy to predict. There is also an element, I think, in which watching supremely talented people excel in their fields is entertaining even if the outcome is already a foregone conclusion. Everybody knew who would win the men's 100 metres at the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, but seeing Usain Bolt set a new Olympic record and run it in 9.69 seconds while celebrating before he had even crossed the finish line still had enormous public appeal because there is just something enjoyable about seeing that. Also, obviously, a lot of football fans support the roughly 11 elite clubs that can still keep hold of their best players and compete for trophies, and you're less likely to see a lack of competition as being as pressing or urgent of a concern if your team is benefiting from that lack of competition and further concentration of wealth. As to whether football can be fixed, well, that is a bit of an odd question because, as far as the people who run the sport are concerned, it isn't yet broken enough. I have made videos in the past about ways in which football could theoretically be fixed, for want of a better word, but it is a futile exercise when those in charge have zero interest in bringing about the same changes that you or I might consider to be desirable. It is too late for all of that. English football certainly has been flogged off to the highest bidder, and anyone who thinks that the Glazers, Clear Lake Capital, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for crying out loud, have the best interests of football fans or the integrity of English football at heart, is so delusional that even QAnon conspiracy theorists are looking at them with a sense of sympathy and embarrassment. No, for now, I am just football's arbitrarist. Earlier I said that there are no certainties in football anymore, but that's not quite true. It is a certainty that nothing will improve, things can only get worse, and it's just a question of whether football or the fragile planet that we call home implodes first. Still, it's only a week to go until Hull City vs Norwich in the first game of the season, and I reckon Euro 2024 should be great. You might as well enjoy it whilst you can. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel and my backup channel, both of which should be on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might want to watch after this one. You could also find me on Instagram or on Twitter via the username @HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so.